One of the most popular episodes on the Untrained podcast was an episode on imposter syndrome. And Dr. Lisa Orbe-Austin is back with Dr. Richard Orbe-Austin on a book they just wrote, Your Child's Greatness, A Parent's Guide to Raising Children Without Imposter Syndrome.
You know, as parents, we are always looking for more advice. How do we raise our children? How do we help them on their path to their greatness? And I think that Doctors Lisa and Richard Orbe-Austin do a great job of making this so accessible, some simple tools that you can take away as a parent. And actually, I think there are also tools you can take away as an adult as you work through these things and sort of redefine what success and greatness means to you. So we hope you tune in. This is a wonderful episode. Welcome to Untrained. Hey, Whitney.
Hey, Iris. We're not alone today.
We are not alone. We have 4 today. Hi, Orbe-Austins. We have Doctors Lisa and Richard Orbe-Austin with us. They've been guests on our show before. They've written a new wonderful book. So, Your Child's Greatness, A Parent's Guide to Raising Children Without Imposter Syndrome. So how did we get here?
Yeah, so I guess after we wrote the first book, we were doing a lot of talks at organizations and talking about imposter syndrome. And always the question would come up, like, how do I prevent this in my kids? And so we would talk about it. And we then started to ponder an idea of a book. But it just felt like at this moment, we were still promoting the first book and really trying to think about what our second book was. And our second book was more about cultures and organizations. But then I had an experience at a talk I was giving for leaders. It was all like women leaders. And we talked about like lazy as a concept. And I was saying, I don't necessarily believe there's a lazy, that in essence, oftentimes it's an indicator of far more going on than you're sort of recognizing. And so I had this conversation with her, we're the whole audience, but she was talking about her son, and he just entered college and he was having a lot of problems in college and he wasn't able to kind of just get his footing right. And so she had mentioned he was smoking weed and there was all kinds of things going on. She said that he was really lazy. And so I said, it'd be interesting to reframe that and think about sort of like what's going on in him that as a result lacks motivation or kind of push for the things that he either wants or can't reach. And so when I ended the talk, I was kind of like talking to the leaders who brought me there. And she, after 20 or 30 minutes, she ran up to me and she was like, before you go, she was like, I called my son and I asked him about this experience that, we'd always thought of him as lazy, but what did he think was going on? And she started talking about how he was sharing about his anxiety and he was sharing about some of the things that he had struggled with academically in school. And she said, for the first time, I felt like I really saw him. And I think he felt really seen because he was like, I kind of want to keep talking about this with you, Mom, because I am struggling. And so she was like, I just want to thank you for that gift. And that's not really what I came there for. I came there to help a bunch of leaders deal with their imposter syndrome and then had this lovely moment. And I think when I got home from that trip, I told Richard, I think we need to work on writing this book. And so that's how it really all began.
How long did it take you to write this book? What was the process like? All books are different, right? You've written 3 now. How did it compare?
That was his response to laughing.
Well, we have different processes, as we say, in terms of writing. So we always had this vision that we'd be writing the books on some magical Caribbean beach, sipping Mai Tais, kind of thinking about chapter by chapter and really having all the time in the world to do it. The time it took us to write it, let's see, we signed the contract in, say, December? I can't remember the timeline, but I know that it was due in August. And so it was a pretty tight timeline. But we're used to tight timelines because ultimately, the first 2 books, we were kind of running on a tight timeline. And so we felt like we had more than enough time, but life happens, the world happens. And so ultimately, I think the bulk of our writing time was probably about 3 or 4 months. And so I'm one to really map out everything and try to write week by week. Lisa will talk about her writing process.
I like an emergency. I like a good old emergency. Richard started writing, I think people started writing in like the early spring or late winter. And I probably didn't start writing till June. Under a desperate hail of I think I was just feeling super anxious about the topic and about, it felt very precious to me as I'm going to be saying these things to parents and I want to make sure that they're absolutely, my imposter syndrome came out, absolutely correct. And like, how can we be, it just felt really kind of like I was having my own imposter, and I was knowing it was going on, but I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And then I couldn't keep pushing. And so then I finally like buckled down over the summer. It was very rough because we're right under that kind of duress. And typically what we do is we split up chapters. Richard takes some ones he does at once, and I take the ones I want. And then we split them up, and then we share them with each other so that we can edit them. But he was giving me chapters and I was giving him nothing. So his editing process had to go super fast. But that's sort of like how we write. We write very, very differently. So,
but it works.
Yeah,
Like
it does.
The book came in on time. There was no concern about that, and so the process may look different, but the outcome got us to where we needed to be.
It doesn't just work because it came out, but it actually is quite good. It's a good manual.
Really
I'm
good.
thinking,
Very thorough.
It's thorough. It's also very, very accessible, which I really, really enjoyed as well. How much did your wonderful daughters, Nia and Maya, come into play in influencing this book too? They're fencers, right? So that's also how I know both of you. They're fencers, and they're on their competitive fencing journey. How much of parenting them has gone into this book?
I think a lot for me, because I think, having lived with imposter syndrome myself and like not wanting my kids to have to live with it, I'm always thinking about it and like how we're responding to their failures, how we're responding to their wins, how we're responding to like what they have in terms of expectations for themselves. I'm kind of always thinking about it because it was such a prevalent part of my own life. And so like, as we were thinking about the chapters, we were reflecting on the things what we had done well and things that we hadn't done so well, like the things that we would have liked to do differently. I think we're thinking, at least I was really thinking about that very presently, which is probably what made it so difficult to write for me because, just as it was hard to really capture sort of that entire experience. And this experience is not even probably 1/3 of the way done, but I just wanted to kind of bring my own experience as a human infallible parent into this experience of the book.
Yeah, I think it's hard to sometimes write about lived experience because you can't see it as clearly.
Well, I think for me, it really was watching their fencing journey and some of the struggles and some of their successes. And so the chapters on performance anxiety, the chapters on coping with failure, even the chapters on internalizing success or combating perfectionism, it all played out in their journey and what we learned about not only them, but ourselves and how we parent. And we really wanted this to be a resource, not to tell parents what they're doing wrong, but to really reassure them of all the things that they're doing well. And in addition, here are some things that you might want to think about differently, really trying to be supportive instead of trying to scold them.
To that point, competitive fencing can be a very ugly arena. It can be beautiful in a lot of ways, and it can be terribly ugly. And so some of the times, I think Richard and I were often processing the ugly moments with our kids who would witness these things and with each other, and also wanting to kind of really like have a platform to discuss also not only the beautiful things, but the ugly things too. And how to deal with those things.
And so who's picking up this book? Do you think it's folks who are like, oh, I identify as having imposter syndrome and I want to make sure I don't pass it on? Or like, I've heard about this thing, imposter syndrome, and I want to make sure my kids don't have it. So I'm going to read this book. All of the above. Tell us a little bit about the ideal purchaser of the book.
Yeah, I think it's anybody who really, has a dream for their kid to, have a great life. It really is as simple as that. Yes, for marketing reasons, we have to think about all those things. But I think we really wanted a place to talk about, I think a lot of people, not everyone, but is invested in their kids, like reaching the pinnacle of whatever it is they want. But the journey there is complicated and difficult. And I think most importantly, we're always thinking about the fact that our kids' mental health, no matter what the achievement or the expectation is, has to be the thing that is our priority. And so like really thinking about how do you get greatness and keep your kids well, I think that's mostly the audience we're looking for.
Yeah, and we actually think about it now, even though it's called the Parent's Guide, it's really a guide to anyone working with children, right? And so we think about coaches, we think about teachers, we think about mentors, we think about any type of caregiver that's really wanting to help a child develop a healthy identity. And one of the things that really came out, and I think Lisa talked about this beautifully, is talking about those who did not get their inner child really tended to. And so this book could actually be for someone even who doesn't have children.
Yes,
who really
I was thinking
struggles with some of these same
Yeah.
types of issues. Performance anxiety, coping with failure, internalizing success, advocating for themselves. So really, ultimately, it's much more expansive than we even initially thought about when we wrote the book.
Yeah, I thought that too, that, even if you read it as a parent, you're also reading it as a parent of your own inner child. So you get, it hits on multiple levels. So since we've got these three folks in the fencing world, should we talk about how, some real world examples of how applying the principles of this book can help navigate really high stress cultures or moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard. Like, in essence, it feels sometimes when you're we can talk from the fencing community, because that's when we understand, we see that everything always feels like it's on the line. Every moment, everyone's worried about their point standings and everything. It's really, really intense. It feels like nothing is low stakes. Everything is high stakes. And so it is really intense to watch parents, who I believe care about their children, like what I would consider veer on the verge of emotional abuse of their children, because they want something for their child that isn't happening in this moment. And so I do think, sometimes when my kid beats a kid I know who's going through a rough time with their parents, it feels hard. I feel happy for my kid and sad for this other kid, because I don't know what they're going home to. And so it's a really complicated emotional kind of morass that, I'm often wanting to say something about or talk to people. And people who want to talk to me, I do kind of talk to them about it. There are a lot of people, because they know we're psychologists, come up to us and be like, I'm really having a hard time with X or Y or Z. And then we try to be super compassionate and try to give them some ideas or tips of how to deal with it. And I do, and yet there are people who don't come up to me, who will never come up to me, and I wish that they would, because I do think there's a lot of people who just don't know better, and then so they don't do better, and so it just is really, I really feel scared for these, mostly what I see now as teenagers, who you can see parts of their personality crystallizing, and it's dark, and I just feel for them,
Yeah, we always think about and talk about the fact that we wanted our kids to love the sport, and that when the sport becomes something that's just unpleasant and dark, there will be unpleasant moments, there will be sad moments, but on the whole, if they continue to enjoy the sport, that's really what we want, right? But when we look at some of these parents who believe this is the only way for their child to go to an Ivy League school, or there's so much, as we say, right? It's high stakes all the time for them, from the time that they're 7 or 8. And you can see in their eyes that, yes, they're trying to please their parent, and maybe they will go down that path to get into Ivy League. But at what cost? At what cost to the relationship with their loved ones, their parent, their friends, their family? And what cost to them in terms of hating something that they once may have really enjoyed? And so when we talk about all these issues, whether it is performance anxiety or feeling like if I don't win, I'm super anxious, because if I don't win, I know what the cost will be on the other side of it, whether it's emotional abuse, physical abuse, how to help a child deal with that. Issues of perfectionism, coping with failure. There's a lot of failure in this sport. And so really helping people to know and understand that, yes, you might fail, but what are you learning from that? And ultimately internalizing success, rather than feeling like, it was just luck that I won that particular bout. Really looking at, what did you do well? How can you actually internalize that, and really understanding who you are, not only as a fencer, but as a person.
We've talked about the inner child, and you have this sort of in 3 parts: belonging, blooming, and being. And I did want to talk about the belonging piece of it, because we just had Isra Nasser come on, and she said something that I'm going to remember always, is bartering achievement for belonging. And
Starts
I think
early.
that's, So I think that as sort of this foundation for toxic productivity. But can you talk a little bit about this piece about belonging, and how parents can set a foundation for that, where, it's not I'm proud of you, or you're doing this for me. I think even the best parents can fall into that trap.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think it's also just rife in our culture too, because people want to be around people who are successful or doing well and want to know their secrets and all this other stuff. And so there can be a lot of exclusionary behavior that exists to kind of, be in the crew that's doing well. And I think it's really important that for us, it's been really important that when we're raising our kids, that they connect with people who they connect with as people, that the friends that they have from fencing are not the most successful fencers, that they're the people that they happen to enjoy and connect with. And so yes, some of them may be the most successful, but that's not the intention. And I think, when we first got into this sport and my kids were unrated fencers and barely started fencing, a lot of people were super mean to them, and would say terrible things to them. And it was about they were in this brand new setting, and kids were kind of making fun of them or saying, I'm not going to fence you, or all kinds of things because you're not good. You're wasting my time. And they were really having a hard time of feeling like a sense of connection. And I didn't want my kids to then eventually do well and then have these people as friends. So we talked about what does this mean, and what does this mean for your self-esteem and how we think about, what's going on in this environment. You don't have to be friends with them. And we just have to remember how you're going to handle this. And it was really powerful, I think especially for both of them, but I think my oldest particularly, because she started kind of late, and she was getting a lot of negative feedback that she would never be any good, and she would, she should try another weapon. She was hearing all kinds of things, and it was really hard for her because she so wanted to be a foilist. It didn't. I don't know why. I don't know why not the other weapons, but she so wanted to be a foilist. So to get all that rejection from people she respected and people she thought were doing well was really hard for her. So we had to do a lot of processing around what was being said to her and what it meant. Because she was losing a lot. She lost 41 bouts before she won her first. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of failure in this. And so failure plus rejection, lack of belonging. We had a hard time, even as psychologists, understanding why does she still want to be in this sport? But she just still wanted to keep going. And, now, she's in a very different place. She's like a B. She got her first top 16 result in a NAC. And, she's having success, but because she is committed in a way to her fencing that works for her, in the sense that she's putting in what she wants to put into this sport to get some results we don't care about. I love her and I want her to succeed, but I have no investment in sort of her being whatever in fencing. I really just want her to get what she wants. But I think she's really found a place for, she has community around all kinds of friends with all kinds of ratings, and really just likes the community that she is connected to. So it's been hard. There's no doubt about it. It's been super hard. But we have always been thinking about her connection and belonging, because at least for me, my growing up, I felt like my achievements were how I felt like I could belong. And I didn't feel worth something in any other domain other than achieving. And so I don't want her to, she loves this and that's why she commits to it, but not because she's not worthy. They always, they say to us all the time, what happens if I lose? What happens if I lose? And I was like, nothing. Nothing happens if you lose. We will still love you. We'll still celebrate you. We'll still talk about it. Nothing. Nothing happens.
Yeah, it would break our heart with our oldest one, which we first started, because that would be the question. And she'd say, would you still love me if I lost all my pounds? And it's yes, we've always loved you, right? The sport is a sport, right? Let's put it into context. And I think for a lot of parents, it's helping them to understand that, because when you're in the midst of it, yes, you want your child to be successful, but you can over-identify with it in such a way that the outcome determines how you treat your child, rather than saying, no matter what happens, yes, I'm disappointed, yes, I'm sad, but I still love you, rather than, oh my God, I can't believe you lost again. Because the thing that I learned from our oldest is that when you love something truly, it doesn't matter about the actual outcome. She kept losing, and even Lisa and I were like, how, why is she continuing? She loved it. She knew she belonged, even before we knew she belonged. She was not going anywhere else.
Ooh,
that's a testament to her.
That's such a beautiful way of thinking about belonging. She belonged to the sport because she loved it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And even when she wasn't getting when she was getting messages that, people weren't accepting her in the sport, she still was like, I don't care. I love this sport.
That's beautiful.
How do you as a parent help them? Just sort of expanding on this idea, because when I work with clients, I tell them, yes, you want to really care about the outcome, but it's not the impetus for the thing, right? So if you love something, if you want to do it, and it's about the process, not the outcome, right? So how do parents, and not just in sports, but academics, music,
Right.
anything that you're helping kids excel in, how do you help them? Like, what's that push-pull, right? Like, how much do I push them? They do love cello, but and I'm talking about Emma. But, some days she doesn't want to practice. But what's this push-pull? What's my responsibility as a parent when I'm trying to help them when they have made a choice to want to achieve at something?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think part of it, again, is this constant processing of what their experience is with whatever it is that they're trying to pursue, whether it's an academic outcome or process, whether it's music, whether it's a sport. Really understanding sometimes what might make them reluctant to do the thing, whether it's practice, whether it's go and do a particular assignment, because sometimes we may make the assumption that we know, and to, Lisa's point about that story, well, maybe they're just lazy. And it's not necessarily oftentimes laziness that's driving it. It's trying to understand what it is. Is it making them anxious to kind of practice? Is it making them anxious to kind of do something that they don't feel that level of competence in? So constantly having these discussions, I think, is so important for parents to be able to take the time to do that. We live in a very quick-paced world where we feel like we've got to go, 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 and we don't really have the time to have these conversations with our children just because they're so overscheduled, we're so overscheduled, we see each other barely on the run. But it is so important to take the time to have some of these conversations to really understand your child's experience.
Yeah, and I think a lot of parents get scared when a kid doesn't want to do something or was motivated and then not motivated. And I think instead of being scared, it might encourage you to be curious. Like, what is really happening here? How to understand it? Sometimes they don't even have the words to tell you, but you're trying to put the pieces together and be curious about what's happening for them. Because I will say with our youngest, I think she had a lot of success early on. And then I think she struggled. And I think for her, it got less interesting and she wanted to go less, or if her sister wasn't going, she wasn't going. And I think partially it was because it was the beginning of the struggle for her. And she didn't have the kind of experience our oldest had, where it was all struggle. It was a lot of success. And so now she's got to learn how to deal with the struggle. And we have to help give her skills to deal with the struggle. Like, how do you stay motivated when you're losing? How do you stay, engaged when it feels like it's not giving you anything back? How do you feel like you invest when you're not getting much from the return? So I think it's really helping them to deal with the process piece, because the process piece, can be lovely. You put in something, you get something. And sometimes you put in something, you get nothing. And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that experience of investing and getting little back or nothing back, and I think that's a hard part for kids.
And I think that being curious and taking the time to be curious with them trains them to be in that curiosity muscle versus just I'm good or bad, right, wrong, but what's going on here? Why don't I want to practice when I did before?
Yes, totally. Yes.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think when I talk to some people or some parents, having this curiosity mindset, I don't know if you've had this, but they're like, well, they should just do it, right? It's the same with why should, it's kind of weak to ask them to do that. They should just push through it, right? So I think we have that too. We hear it in the corporate space, that too, that voice of one generation versus another. Well, they should just grind through it. They should do this, push, drive, right? Why are we asking the kids' opinions? Why should I care about what they're thinking, right? So when parents say that, what is something you respond with?
Yeah, it reminds me of a moment that I saw at a tournament where the kid was having a conversation with her father, and the father was like, "Just do what I say," and she was like, "I have a point about this. I don't want you to do X," and he was like, "You need to respect me." And he was losing her in the whole conversation because she needed him to show up in a certain way, and he was refusing to, around respect and around authority. And, it was really difficult because I think her point was actually correct, even though he thought his point was correct because he was older, which is that she wanted him to calm down, stop yelling at the ref. And I think, she was more rational than he was. And so I do think one of the things that is really an igniter of imposter syndrome is authoritarianism in parenting. And so when you believe you are right, or there's no other outcome for this, a kid doesn't get to develop their own sense of control, their own sense of trusting their own thoughts, their own sense of feeling like this is wrong and I have a right to say that. it does sort of dampen that part of them that goes on forever, right? So then when the boss tells them somewhere down the line, just, I don't care if you're burnt out, just finish the project, they will. And the consequences to them will be devastating over a long term. And so I do think like it can be hard for a parent to take feedback from a kid, especially in a difficult and high visible moment. But I think it's so important for them to feel heard in those moments more than anything, more than anyone judging you, more than anyone watching. What matters most is your kid feels heard by you. And I think that is really hard as a parent, but is really important.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think it's really being able to ask a parent, well, how successful has it been when you just try to get them to just do it, right? Like how much is it helping?
Zero.
And how successful is it for you, right? Even for your own thing, if someone says just do something, it's again this question of what is preventing them from doing it. Like Lisa and I always joke when parent who may not even have been a fencer is trying to give feedback to the kid about a move and they're doing all this. And we're like, you try to do that, right? It's not like the kid is not trying, right? It's like they're trying to do something that you probably could never do. So it's not as if they want to miss. They're trying their best. Yeah. And so really being able, and it takes a level of humility, it takes a level of security in your role as a parent to know and understand that it's not just about being in control and being right, that it's also about respecting your child and having them be able to develop their own sense of view, their own particular identity, their own way to make decisions, and being able to recognize, again, what are the barriers that are preventing them from doing that.
I feel like Richard just dropped the mic. Just drop the mic there.
He totally did. I love that. Well, and you guys are giving us such concrete, specific ways to examples. And I'd love if you could also just touch on, two things I hear from other parents all the time: perfectionism and performance anxiety. So could you speak to those things and some maybe concrete examples of what you talk about in the book and how you advocate showing up?
Yeah. I think, with perfectionism, I think one of the things that I think is important is to recognize that sometimes there are endogenous or internal reasons why a kid is perfectionistic, just part of who they are. And sometimes there are exogenous, so the environment is causing the perfectionism. And so in both cases, you can get support for that. And I think it's really important because I think a lot of kids who are perfectionistic get praised and thought of as like amazing and great and look at this. But oftentimes there's a lot of cost to them that's kind of invisible. And I think that cost is what we have to be looking for those kids, especially to kind of help them learn to make mistakes and learn to be fallible and learn to be human. Because I do think like that kind of kid is usually lauded. They're praised, they're awesome, like they're getting all their homework done, they're doing it ahead of time, but there's often something going on underneath. And so, figuring that out as a parent is really important because we talk about this in the book. In some cases, it's biological, and you do need to kind of intervene with like a psychiatrist and somebody else because the compulsive nature of perfectionism can be related to something going on with them biologically. And then sometimes we're pushing the perfectionism in some way because we're praising the times in which they're more perfectionistic. We're kind of giving them support for that kind of behavior where we don't want to see the mistakes. The mistakes take more time. They take more work to deal with than does the perfect performance. And so I do think really thinking about, both of those pieces and thinking about it is not a great quality to have. Like they're suffering and oftentimes, and what can we do to kind of alleviate that both from what we're doing and if there's a biological reason, addressing that pretty directly too.
And I think oftentimes when we think about performance anxiety, it is tied to perfectionism as well. And oftentimes people who are perfectionistic believe that the reason they're successful is because they're perfectionistic. And so when you try to decouple the performance from the perfectionism, they don't really want to give up the perfectionism because they believe that is the only way that they can stay motivated or be competitive, when the reality is it's not. It's really actually hindering them. So helping them to know and understand that, I think, is key. When we talk about performance anxiety, whether it's with or without perfectionism, I think it's really helping people to understand that some of the anxiety comes before the actual performance. And so how do you intervene and support the child prior to the performance? And so what are you talking about? How are they feeling? How are you helping them to calm themselves? Is it meditation? Is it going for a walk? Really helping them to think about and visualize success, talking through their fears and what, again, in that worst case scenario, like with our oldest, it was always, well, I'm going to lose all my matches and somehow or another fear like we're going to remove love, but really reassuring them that none of that will happen. And then during the performance, really helping them to think about what will calm their nerves, really thinking about interventions that are successful for that. Again, back to the visualization of success and worst case scenarios. And then the last piece is after the actual performance, really being able to debrief it. Sometimes when people feel like, okay, I just failed, that's it, I don't want to talk about it. It's important when they're emotionally regulated, right? Not right after they are suffered a disappointing loss or performance. You don't want to run up to them and be like, well, why did you do that? You should have done something. You want to give them time. Some people might want to talk about it right away, but some may not. So you will know your child and really ask them. We've asked our children that and learned, because we were initially anxious to talk about what happened, what could be done differently. But we learned to give them some space. And when they're ready to have a conversation that is not necessarily what you did wrong, but really talking through, well, what are the things that went well and what might you do differently? Let's talk about that and what allowed you to feel less anxious. And again, not so much about the outcome, but how they were feeling in that particular moment and being able to debrief that as well. And then having the cycle go through again, really being able to consistently address it prior to performances.
Yep. And getting better and better at understanding what your child needs in the cycle of performance. And I think also, too, managing your own performance anxiety as a parent, because I think I see a lot of parents managing performance anxiety, but they're having so much anxiety. It's not really going so well about how they're managing their own kids. And really, you're first. You got to manage your own performance first, and then you can manage your kids', anxiety around it.
I love that. And also, could you speak a little bit to the part we can't control that also is a big factor, which is the coach or the team or, the culture in which your child is being immersed. And sort of, I find that the older my kids get, the more it's like, well, you're going to have to learn to deal with people like this versus let's whisk you away and save you from this difficult coach. So could you talk a little bit how you manage that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was always a really important thing for us from the beginning, is that we wanted to coach in an environment that had a similar philosophy to us. Mm-hmm. And we didn't really know about, when we first signed up with our coach, we didn't really know about his previous performance. We weren't looking at that. We were looking at what is the kind of personality of coach that would fit our kids the best, because we knew, as for who they weren't going to last if it was someone they couldn't stand, or they don't like to be in environments in which there's so much rub that they don't feel comfortable or safe. So I do think there's a difference between learning how to deal with sort of like feedback and difficult moments and an abusive coach. Mm-hmm. And so I do think like no kid should have to deal with an abusive coach, and there are a lot out there.
Yeah.
And they cover it in their ability to perform and get your kid to certain places. And they can often do that, but are they behaving in ways that are producing that outcome as a result of withholding, feedback, positive feedback from your kid, right? They're behaving as hopefully in ways you would never behave toward your kids, but in essence, they're doing the same thing a parent could do that would kind of crave the performance, which is like withholding from them unless they get to where they want. I have seen so many coaches get pissed off at a kid who is not doing well in the bout when they're coaching them, and they just leave. And there's probably no scarier feeling for a kid who's struggling on the strip to have their coach walk away in a moment in which they're desperately trying to do whatever. I'm sure they're not purposely pissing them off generally. And it just feels really like they're teaching them abandonment issues so early on. And how can you ever trust someone like that after they've left you and done it repeatedly? So I do think like when you sense your kid is there are many coaches out there. There are many opportunities. Like I so encourage, I've had situations where parents have come up to me and their coach has done something terrible in front of me, and they know I'm a psychologist, and they'll come up to me and they'll be like, what do you think of that? And I was like, I think terrible things about that. And I was like, I think you should have a conversation with them, and here's what I would say. And so like, I can't help it, but I don't want to permit that kind of behavior when I've witnessed it. I was like, oh, it's okay. It's not okay. And so I think when it's not okay for your kid, and it's different from dealing with like difficult feedback. Like, even though our coach is amazing and lovely and warm, and our kids sometimes are really bad at like talking to them or engaging with them, or constantly working on them building a relationship with this adult person. They don't have to often develop relationships with adult men in their lives. So there's a real hard kind of learning, like learning curve for them, because they are quiet, generally little girls who don't have to do this outside of like, their experience with fencing generally. So there's a lot of work that I think we're doing on kind of really recognizing where can you grow, what's inappropriate, like you're always sort of measuring out those things. But I don't think an abusive coach, no matter what result they're producing, is okay for your kid, because they can damage them in and of themselves,
Yeah, and I think that's where you start. It's zero tolerance for abuse, right? And that so many parents, though, feel powerless and that they don't know the sport, they don't know how to coach their child. And so if this one coach is getting results through their particular abusive approach, I think many parents are desperate and fearful that, okay, if I either say something to that person, they may then, decide they don't want to work with us anymore, one, or two, that if I do leave, I'm not going to be able to have that same level of success that my child is having with that particular coach. And we always go back to, it's a sport. At the end of the day, it is not life. And so much of it is just tied to this is life. And people then realize, though, what is the cost of having your child be abused all these years to be successful in something that is not actually the thing that they will do for the bulk of their lives, most likely. And so helping people come to that perspective, I think, is important, and helping them to feel a sense of power that, like, ultimately the coach works for you. You don't work for the coach. We see it so much where it seems like the parents are working for the coach. The coach is like telling them to do this or do that and yelling at their kid in front of them. And the parent is just kind of like, I guess, just listen to the coach. Like, we would never tolerate that. And that is why we felt very lucky to have the coach that we have. But ultimately, we know if that's the only coach in a particular area and you feel like, well, if I don't get this coach, then what am I going to do? Move? Like, you have to, though, be able to think about protecting your child at all costs and ultimately thinking about the bigger picture when we're thinking about ways to support them.
And it makes me go back to the title of your child's greatness and how we define greatness. And I think that's so much the origin of this podcast, of how we define greatness. And I want to punt it to you, Iris, because so much of your story was in what Dr. Lisa Orbe-Austin, Dr. Richard Orbe-Austin were just talking about with fencing. So I wanted to hear what was going on in your mind and how we define greatness.
Yeah, well, they both know my story, and I think the audience probably knows it too. Is, gosh, I wish Lisa and Richard were around and could actually intervene, because that was one of the things. Is there was no one that intervened, and I think it was a different time where it was like, this is how coaches operate. But I do like what they both said, because what it's telling me as a parent is, when I make decisions, I really have to know my child and know the relationships I want them to build. I also want to know, what are the lessons I want my child to learn. It's not about what sport do I want them to do, or what's the best school, or all of this other noise, right? It's returning to what's best for your child and the lessons you want them to learn in their life. Does that make sense? It's like more of about the process than the outcome, right? Like, I am building a human being that needs to exist in this world. They need to interact with people. They have to make choices for themselves. How am I going to make these decisions so they help them have these lessons learned? And I think when we look at sport and other things, music, sport, anything, clubs, all the things that you sign your kid up for, which, by the way, kids are signed up for ridiculous amounts of things, probably mine included. How do we make these choices so that they can learn these lessons, rather than like, how do we make these choices so that they can go to Harvard University, right? So I think we need to be careful about the choices and why we're making those choices. And sometimes I don't think we ask ourselves, as a consumer of all these things, what is the point? What is the ultimate point, right? What am I trying to do here?
What do we want them to be great at, right? And I think I hear you saying, Iris, and what we're talking about here is we want them to be great at knowing themselves, regulating themselves, bouncing back from things. Those are the things we want them to be great at.
I did want to ask one more question I know we're sort of finishing up here. One of the biggest things I took away from the book too is help your child. This is something close to me. Help your child build self-care routines, because I will tell you, my kid in public school, she'll take a day off and have incredible amounts of anxiety because she's like, oh my God, I'm going to miss all this work. I can't do it. I'm going to miss a test. And I'm like, who cares? And I'm the parent saying that. I'm like, it's fine. Just take the day off. You're exhausted. They're tired. She's so tired sometimes. I'm like, listen, just sleep in. I even have her take a mental health day. She can choose what day that is. Every month she gets a mental health day. And I get dinged as a parent at the end of the year about like how many days they take off and all the things. So I think it's near and dear to my heart. So speak a little bit to how can we help our children build self-care routines, especially when the environment around them really isn't supporting that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that becomes really important is sort of modeling it. So if they see you telling them, but you're not doing anything around it, they don't see it as valuable. They don't see examples of it. So I do think it's really important for parents to be modeling great self-care, which takes work and effort and like a structure around your own. But I think, I remember when I was a kid and I would say I played basketball and I was encouraged to kind of get training outside of there and do some exercising outside of there. So I would want to exercise and my dad would be like, if you need to exercise, you can go mow the lawn. And so but for me, the exercise was a part of my self-care. It was a part of me kind of being able to separate from work or my family and do that stuff and not have to have an outcome out of it that was something direct. And I think we want to kind of think about what self-care routines are good for their process that they like. And we've experimented with a variety of things. There's a lot of experimentation in self-care and figuring out what your kid likes and what they'll commit to. So it's a process. Our kids don't really love meditation, but we keep doing it. We keep kind of talking to them about ways maybe we can make it shorter, maybe we can make it guided. So we're kind of always like playing with different ideas, and we're often curious. Like our little one loves like art, and so we kind of let her get messy sometimes, which we often regret. But I think we kind of like try to lean into the things that give them a sense of peace that are not necessarily things we would do. But I think it's a combination of we talk about this too a lot, is that physical, mental, and reflective self-care, and that they have something in each of those buckets, at least one thing, but if not, like a couple of things in each of those buckets. And then we have to be really central in helping them develop that, even if you have to go against the system. Because I'm often encouraging my own clients who have kids who are younger to fight the system around how much homework their kid has, or because in essence, like their kid's drowning and they're 6, these are things you have to fight sometimes the system around as a parent. And sometimes the system doesn't want you to win and you just got to take it on the chin. But you protect your kid, number one, is I guess our main theme. But I think developing those routines are so important because they take them with them.
Yeah, and I think it's a increasingly a huge challenge because we've talked a lot about toxic work cultures, but we haven't really gotten into toxic academic culture, right? That schools feel like the more work they load on, that somehow or another it demonstrates that they are prestigious or they are really rigorous, when that is not the case. I'm always kind of like blown away when it's like, is the child going to actually learn? Is that child learning, or are you just giving them stuff to do so that you can say, we did all these things? And so ultimately, that's one, really being able to understand the toxicity of a particular culture now in the academic space. And then to your point, and to Lisa's point, really understanding what it is that will resonate for your child relative to self-care, and then being able to model it. And so, as much as our kids don't like meditation, they see that, I've had a meditation practice for over 25 years. So every morning they know daddy's going to meditate for like 20 minutes. And then I'll go for a run. And so they know and understand some of these particular aspects. And we're always trying to figure out what will resonate for them. So it is being patient and being able to tolerate experimentation and to understand what will work for them. But having them recognize that self-care is part of the equation, and it's a critical part of the equation, not some sort of like self-indulgent side thing, but it's integral to their overall well-being.
So where can we sign up to be your kids in our next lifetime?
I think they have something to say about that. In the sense that, they're not so great as you think they are.
Well, we usually end with, what's one thing you want the audience to take away from today's discussion? So I'll throw it to you, Lisa, first.
I mean, I think it's like to be curious about your kid and to really, when you run into problems with them, to be more curious than you are coming up with a conclusion about what is happening. And that conclusion should come from data that you're receiving and also what you're hearing from your child. And that to me is important, and putting them first, in terms of like the outside world, Yeah,
and I'd just add to that you were doing well as a caregiver, and you don't have to be perfect, and really being able to open yourself up to learn from your child, I think, is so critical without having to judge yourself or to judge them in that process.
And if you're wondering if you're doing it all right or you want some more skills, you can pick up a copy of this book and it'll walk you through how to be, it's like coaching from YouTube, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's the same. It's just as accessible as your other two books. So also, if you're working on your own imposter syndrome, as you're kind of working on trying to help your children as well, so it might be a good thing to have both, have all of them, all three of those books. So thank you so much for your time. And
thank you.
My
Brilliant.
pleasure.
Yeah, I get to see Lisa a lot more. So I just want to make everybody jealous. But anyways, I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation. What do we say at the end of every podcast, Whitney?
Keep untraining and buy your copy of Your Child's Greatness.
Yes, keep on training. And if you like what you hear, make sure that you like us on Apple Podcasts, on YouTube. Hey, why don't you take a second? Tell us how you like it. Give us a question or two. We'd love to hear from our tribe.